Let me take you back to North Africa, 1943. The air is hot, heavy, and choked with smoke. The ground trembles as American armor pushes across the desert, but leading this advance isn't your typical by the book officer. No, this is a man the Germans learned to fear by name, Brigadier General Terry de la Mesa Allen, or as his men called him, Terrible Terry. He wasn't the kind of general who stayed behind the lines. You'd find him standing on the hood of a jeep, binoculars in hand, bullets whizzing past. He had a cigarette between his teeth, mud on his boots, and a grin that said, "I dare them to try." To his soldiers, he was the embodiment of courage, a leader who fought alongside them, ate their rations, and cursed with them in the dirt. To the Germans, he was chaos incarnate, a man whose aggressive tactics tore through their defenses faster than they could react. Soft background sound of wind sweeping across dunes in dispatches intercepted by Allied intelligence. German officers described him as reckless, unpredictable, and dangerous. They called him the kind of commander who made battlefields bleed faster. And they were right. Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was rewriting what it meant to be an American fighting force. Under his command, the U.S. Army wasn't just learning to fight. It was learning how to win. Camera pans across burning tanks, American flags waving behind advancing troops, but who was this man? What forged a general so fierce that even the enemy gave him a nickname whispered with respect? And fear, let's go back to the beginning. Let me take you back to 1888, the year Terry de la Mesa Allen was born at Fort Douglas, Utah. The army wasn't just his career. It was his inheritance. His father, an officer, wanted discipline and formality for his son. But even as a boy, Terry Allen had a spark, a restless defiance that refused to bow to authority. At West Point, that defiance burned too brightly. He wasn't the perfect cadet, in fact. He was expelled not once, but twice. Rules bored him. Uniforms were fine, but blind obedience, never. He believed in instinct, courage, and loyalty earned on the battlefield, not demanded by rank. Camera pans across old sepia photos of West Point cadets, then shifts to an empty classroom and Terry's name struck from the rolls, but fate has a way of testing those born to lead. When World War I erupted, Allen found his chance. Despite his rebellious past, he earned a commission in the U.S. Cavalry and proved something extraordinary, that leadership isn't about perfect records. It's about grit, heart, and the will to stand tall when the world collapses around you. In the mud of the Western Front, under constant shellfire, Allen showed the courage that would later define him. He learned to make decisions not from manuals but from the cries of wounded men and the smoke of chaos. Soft crack of thunder, echo of distant artillery, and that's when something inside him hardened. Terry Allen realized that soldiers don't follow stars or stripes on a uniform, they follow men they trust. Years later, when his Big Red One stormed the deserts of Africa, that lesson would become his creed. He wasn't interested in pomp or politics, only victory, and the men who fought for it. Camera fades to Allen staring across a battlefield at dawn. He wasn't a general shaped by tradition. He was one forged in rebellion, and war was about to give him the stage he was born for. Let me take you to North Africa, 1942. The sun was merciless, a white fire hanging over endless seas of sand. To the east, the Germans had a name that commanded dread Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His Afrika Korps moved with precision and speed, turning the desert into a chessboard of death. And into this inferno marched Terry Allen and the men of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. They were new to desert war, still learning the land, the tactics, the rhythm of survival. But Allen wasn't intimidated. He didn't see Rommel as a legend, he saw him as a challenge. Camera pans across a convoy of dusty American half-tracks, soldiers' faces hardened, goggles reflecting the blazing horizon. Allen's leadership was unconventional. While other generals stood behind lines and gave orders through radios, he lived among his men. Slept in the sand, ate from the same rations. When morale faltered, he didn't lecture, he fought beside them. One soldier later said, "You didn't salute him, you followed him, because he was there when the shooting started." Under his command, the Big Red One hit the Germans with a ferocity they didn't expect. American firepower, the Sherman tanks, the 50 calibers, the relentless artillery began to speak the language of dominance. But the real weapon wasn't metal. It was spirit. The kind of spirit Allen ignited in men who refused to back down. Close up of Allen's dust-covered face, eyes scanning the battlefield, wind whipping his collar, the Germans soon learned that this wasn't the same green American army they mocked in the beginning. They were facing a leader who didn't just command, he unleashed. Rommel had ruled the desert for 2 years. But now he faced something new, a wolf who didn't fight by the rules, who didn't retreat, and who didn't care how many medals his enemies wore. The desert fox had finally met his match, the desert wolf of the big red one. Let me take you into one of those North African nights, quiet, except for the low hum of generators and the whisper of wind over dunes. Around small fires, the men of the 1st Infantry Division sat together, tired, dirty, and hungry. And somewhere among them, without ceremony or escort, sat Terry Allen. He didn't wear the polished aura of a general. His uniform was creased, his boots dusty, his helmet dented. But when he spoke, men listened. He didn't talk like an officer, he talked like a soldier. He cursed when they cursed. He laughed when they laughed. And when the enemy came close, he fought right alongside them. Camera pans across faces of young soldiers' fear, exhaustion, then pride as Allen joins them with a grin and a cigarette. That's why they called him Terrible Terry Allen. Not because he was cruel, but because he was unstoppable. He was terrible to the enemy, terrible to bureaucracy, terrible to anyone who got in the way of his men's survival. His soldiers knew one thing for sure: if Allen was with them, they'd make it through the fight. He had an instinct for morale. When food ran low, he made sure coffee kept flowing. When spirits broke, he cracked a joke or ordered an impromptu baseball game in the middle of the desert. To him, keeping men alive wasn't just about tactics, it was about giving them something worth fighting for. Close-up of Allen's hand on a soldier's shoulder, dust swirling in the dim light of dawn. The Germans couldn't understand it, how an American general could make ordinary men fight with such fury. But Allen knew the secret. His soldiers didn't fight for him, they fought with him. That bond forged in sand, sweat, and shrapnel made his division one of the most feared and respected in the entire U.S. Army. Wherever the big red one went, the enemy braced themselves because Terry Allen's men didn't break. They broke through. Let me take you to the early months of 1943. The sun burns the desert like a furnace, and the air trembles with the echo of tank engines and artillery thunder. This is Kasserine Pass, where American forces faced their harshest trial. The terrain was cruel, jagged hills, and choking dust turned every movement into a struggle. The German Afrika Korps, led by seasoned veterans, struck with brutal precision. And for many young Americans, this was their first true taste of war. It was chaos, confusion, and fear. Yet in that storm of defeat, one man refused to back down: Terry Allen. He rode among his men while shells rained down and machine guns tore through the ridges. He didn't shout orders from a command tent miles away. He was there in the thick of it. His voice cutting through the panic. Hold the line, boys, hold it. Because we are Americans, and Americans never quit. The men steadied their rifles and dug in their heels. They had seen generals before, but never one like Allen. He fought with them, cursed with them, bled with them. And in those desperate moments, something changed. The soldiers who once wavered began to fight with renewed fury. They were no longer scared kids in olive drab. They were warriors, forged by fire and led by a man who believed they could stand against anything the Germans could throw at them. When the smoke cleared, the Americans had learned their hardest lesson. But they had also earned something priceless: confidence. Allen's division did not crumble, it adapted. He showed his men how to fight smart, how to hit fast, how to never let fear dictate their fate. Kasserine was no victory on paper. But for Terry Allen, it was the crucible that turned raw recruits into hardened veterans. From that day forward, every man under his command carried a quiet pride. They had seen the worst. They had survived because terrible Terry Allen refused to let them fall. After Kasser, in the desert itself seemed to whisper the name Terry Allen. His men marched differently now, their stride heavier, their eyes sharper. They no longer doubted who they were. They were Americans under a leader who would rather die beside them than live behind them. The Germans took notice 2 reports filtered through their ranks that the Americans had a general unlike any other one, who moved with his soldiers, one who struck without hesitation, and never stopped to rest when victory was in reach. They called him unpredictable, ruthless, relentless. To them, he was a storm in human form. Allen turned the lessons of Kasserine into a new way of fighting. He drilled his men not with endless parades, but with real combat maneuvers. He taught them to think fast, hit hard, and move faster than the enemy could react. He turned the big red one into a living weapon that could strike anywhere, anytime in the blistering heat of Tunisia. His troops advanced through enemy positions with astonishing speed. American tanks roared through sand and smoke, while infantry followed tight behind their machine guns, chattering in perfect rhythm. The battlefield no longer belonged to the enemy. It belonged to the Americans, who fought with a purpose that could not be shaken. Allen himself never slowed. He was always at the front, dirty and grinning, covered in dust, his uniform torn, his pistol at his side. To his men, he was more than a general. He was the embodiment of courage and defiance. When he appeared, the men felt unstoppable, because he made them believe they were. The Germans began to whisper that when terrible Terry Allen was coming, their lines would break, not because of his numbers or his tanks, but because his soldiers fought with something deeper, faith in their commander and faith in the unstoppable force of America. The desert campaign was no longer a proving ground. It had become a declaration. America was here to fight, and under Terry Allen, America would never bow. The nickname spread like wildfire through ranks and across the battlefront. Terrible Terry Allen, a name that carried both fear and respect to his men. It was a badge of pride to his enemies. It was a warning. Everywhere Allen went, stories followed him, tales of him charging ahead of his lines, laughing as shells burst nearby of him, pulling wounded men to safety while barking orders through smoke and fire. He wasn't the kind of general who pointed to a map. He was the kind who pointed to the enemy and said, "Follow me." His leadership broke every mold of military tradition. He didn't care about medals or ceremonies. He cared about victory and the men who made them possible. If a soldier fought hard, he earned Allen's respect. If an officer hid behind ranks, he earned Allen's fury. At night, when the fighting paused, he would sit among his troops, sharing coffee and stories, talking not as a superior, but as one of them. He knew their fears, their exhaustion, their longing for home, and because of that they followed him without question. The Germans could not comprehend it. How could a man so unruly, so informal, command such loyalty? They tried to label him reckless, but every time they met him in battle, they learned the truth. Allen recklessness was precision disguised as chaos. He struck fast, hit hard, and vanished before the enemy could recover. To the men of the Big Red One, he wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of what made America unstoppable, bold, unpredictable, fearless. He gave them permission to fight with heart, not just orders. Terrible Terry became more than a name. It became a legend, carried from the deserts of Africa to the shores of Sicily. A legend that said wherever he led, the Germans would tremble, because they knew what was coming: an army with the soul of its leader and the spirit of a nation that refused to be defeated. Let me take you to the summer of 1943. The Mediterranean sun blazes over the sea as waves of American landing craft cut through the surf toward the shores of Sicily. Inside them are the men of the Big Red One, and at their head stands terrible Terry Allen. This was no ordinary operation. It was a test of everything Allen had built: discipline forged through chaos, courage hardened by loss, and an unbreakable trust between commander and soldier. As the ramps dropped and the first shots cracked across the beach, Allen's men surged forward through fire and sand. They moved like a living machine, each man knowing exactly what to do, each one driven by the certainty that their general believed in them completely. Allen himself moved up the beach in the thick of it, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his boots sinking into the sand. Bullets tore through the air, mortars exploded around him, yet he pressed on, shouting orders, steadying panicked soldiers, and dragging the wounded to cover. His presence was like a force of nature. Wherever he went, fear dissolved, and fury took its place. The Germans and Italians defending the island soon realized they weren't fighting just another invading force. They were facing something different, an army that fought with precision and passion, an army led by a man who turned every setback into momentum. Allen's tactics in Sicily were fast, brutal, and brilliant. He used deception, speed, and sheer aggression to overwhelm enemy defenses within days. American forces broke through positions that had been considered untouchable for the men of the Big Red One. Sicily became proof of everything they had endured. Since North Africa, they were no longer learning to fight, they were defining how modern war would be fought. And at the center of it all stood terrible Terry Allen, the man the Germans feared, the man his soldiers trusted, and the man who led America's unstoppable charge across Europe. Victory in Sicily should have been a moment of triumph for Terry Allen and his men, but even in war, politics had a way of creeping into the battlefield highway. Command began to take notice of Allen not just for his victories, but for his defiance of strict military decorum to them. He was too rough, too informal, too close to his soldiers. They wanted polished discipline. Allen gave them raw fire. They wanted salutes and ceremonies. Allen gave them mud, sweat, and results. General Eisenhower respected Allen's combat genius, but pressure from above mounted. Some officers accused Allen of letting discipline slip too far, of leading like a cowboy instead of a commander. But what they didn't see was the bond that kept his division fighting harder than any other unit. On the front in the camps, his men stood taller whenever his name was mentioned. They knew no general cared for them more fiercely. They would have followed him anywhere, and that loyalty scared the bureaucrats who believed no soldier should worship a man more than the chain of command. When the order finally came for Allen to be relieved of duty, the camp fell silent. Men who had faced artillery and tanks without flinching stood speechless. Their leader, the heart of their division, was being taken from them, not by the enemy, but by their own system. Allen accepted it quietly, with that same half-grin that had carried him through every battle. He told his men to keep fighting and to make him proud, and they did, because he had taught them how to fight like Americans, fierce, free, and unbreakable. Even the Germans noticed his absence. Reports from captured officers spoke of relief in their tone. Americans' most unpredictable general was gone, they said, but deep down they knew his spirit was not terrible. Terry Allen had already carved his mark into history, not through medals or titles, but through the hearts of the soldiers who carried his lessons into every battle that followed. War moved on. And so did history. New campaigns, new commanders, new faces in the fight for freedom. But the legend of terrible Terry Allen refused to fade. His men carried his spirit across Europe, into the hedgerows of Normandy, through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and across the Rhine. Wherever they went, they fought with the same grit and heart that Allen had burned into them. To them, he wasn't just a memory, he was a compass that pointed toward courage, no matter the odds. Allen himself went on to lead again in new battles under new banners. But he never changed, he never traded his muddy boots for polished ones. He never stopped walking among the soldiers, sharing coffee, sharing laughs, sharing danger. And even when the war finally ended, and the guns fell silent, his name lingered like an echo in the hearts of those who served under him. The Germans had feared him because they could not predict him. His men had loved him because they could always trust him. And history remembers him because he embodied what America stood for: strength, independence, and a refusal to bow to fear. He proved that leadership was not born in classrooms or polished halls, but in the chaos of battle where character was tested and courage defined. He proved that the bond between a leader and his men could turn ordinary soldiers into legends. When the last sunset fell on the war, terrible Terry Allen's story became part of something larger, the story of a nation that fought not for conquest, but for freedom, a nation that produced men who led from the front, who dared the impossible, who never surrendered. And as the years passed, a new generation studied the war. They found in Allen's name a lesson that still rings true today, that real leadership means standing with your people through fire and fury, and that power comes not from fear, but from faith, the same faith that made the Germans fear the Americans, and the same faith that made terrible Terry Allen a name carved forever in the soul of victory.